Hello my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 weapon tier list and guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today we are discussing the best simple weapons in Baldur's Gate 3. These weapons are usually used by clerics and druids, but also include awesome options for a number of other characters. The highest damage output weapon in the game is one of these weapons, and they include incredible weapons for archers and thrown weapon characters as well. So this weapon set is going to be seeing a lot of play, because some of the most powerful characters in the game use it. I'm including clubs, handaxes, javelins, light hammers, maces, and sickles in this tier list. There's some simple weapons that aren't included, daggers and quarterstaffs we covered already in previous lists, as well as bows, and spears and two-handed great clubs I'm going to be including under polearms and two-handed weapons, respectively. But this weapon set is so powerful that it is very much worth knowing which ones are worth picking up and which ones you can safely ignore. Just as with my previous weapon and item tier lists, we're going to be comparing these weapons based on their power level when you get access to them in the game. How good are they compared to the equipment you already have? In other words, the question we're answering is, when you get this weapon, should you pick it up and use it? In S tier, I'm placing weapons that are best in slot for a wide array of builds or specific, extremely powerful builds. In A tier, weapons that make interesting alternatives to S tier weapons, can enable unique strategies, or do something kind of cool in a powerful way. They're good for one really strong build, that kind of thing. In B tier, weapons that give you interesting options. Either they are used for one encounter, or they will be used for small portions of the game, or they enable off-meta strategies or parties. In C tier, weapons that do have some use, but most parties can safely ignore them. And in D tier, weapons that very rarely have a use, because there are usually just better options available. Finally, before I begin, I do want to take a quick moment to say thank you so much to Mr. Geminius for the $5 donation, Josh Hobbs for the $5, as well as Gonzalo Mena Fuenzalida, Zidistra, and Jeffrey Sims for becoming channel members. Thank you so much, my friends. I really appreciate it, and I especially appreciate it right now because this week my old PC died, and it's thanks to your incredibly generous support that I was able to replace it. So it really does mean a lot, and I really do appreciate it. Thank you so much. Alright, let's rate some items. I'm going to start by discussing the base properties and weapon actions of each of these types of weapons. If you're not interested in learning about those, then feel free to skip ahead to the Club of Hill Giant Strength, but I think it's worth going over the weapon actions so that you know the sort of default abilities that all of these types of weapons have available to them. The club is a light, one-handed weapon that does a d4 of damage. Being light, it means that you can wield one in each hand without having the dual wielder feat, so you can effectively dual wield clubs, and comes with the concussive smash option. Concussive smash is pretty good. It's a weapon action, you can use it once per short rest as a normal attack, and you daze the enemy, which prevents them from taking reactions, decreases their armor class, and gives them disadvantage on wisdom saves. Preventing enemies from taking reactions is a pretty powerful effect because a lot of honor mode bosses, their legendary actions are turned off if you prevent their reactions. It also can be used to move away without triggering an attack of opportunity, and it can be used to prevent an enemy from counterspelling. So there's a lot of options for daze. It also just makes them easier to hit by sometimes a quite significant margin because it reduces their armor class by their dexterity modifier, which for some enemies can be like a -5 penalty to their armor class. And disadvantage on wisdom saves is also pretty good. You can use that to land some pretty powerful effects. So the ability to apply daze is definitely useful. The problem with the club in general is just that it is a weaker version of a bunch of other weapons. It does a d4 of damage, maces do a d6. You can dual wield it, but you can also dual wield handaxes, which do a d6. So there just isn't that much use for the basic club because any of these other types of simple weapons just outperform it at their base level. So even if you're just using non-magical weapons at the beginning, you're better off with dual-wielded handaxes or a mace if you're going for a one-handed weapon. D tier for the club. Some of the upgraded versions have uses, but the basic club will never see play. The Handaxe is a light weapon that does a d6 of base damage, and so can be dual-wielded without the dual-wielder feat, and also is a thrown weapon, meaning that you can throw it for the full weapon die of damage rather than the normal damage by weight that non-thrown weapons get. It also comes with the Lacerate weapon action, which allows you to potentially inflict bleeding on an enemy once per short rest. Overall, I think Lacerate is one of, if not the weakest weapon action available to weapons in PG3. Bleeding's a pretty reasonable effect, but there's a bunch of ways to inflict bleeding without a saving throw, and it doesn't do a lot of damage. The main use for bleeding is the disadvantage on Constitution saves, so you'll certainly use Lacerate if you've got a weapon with it equipped, assuming that you remember to activate Lacerate, but it's not something that would draw me to a weapon. There are two main uses for the Handaxe. Firstly, it's a dual-wieldable weapon. It's a light weapon with the highest damage die for light weapons, so a character that's set up to dual-wield simple weapons may end up using a Handaxe. The obvious pick for this would be a Spore Druid, but Spore Druids actually don't have Handaxe proficiency, so they're going to use scimitars instead for that purpose. So there's actually not like a lot of builds that would specifically want to dual-wield Handaxes, but it is something that you definitely can do if that's what your character is set up to do. The real main use, though, is that they are a thrown weapon, and for throwing weapon characters, any weapon with the thrown weapon tag is really very useful. As a thrown weapon, they have one of the higher damage dice for thrown weapons. Handaxes and Javelins have the highest available damage dice. And while your thrown weapon characters will typically have a magical thrown weapon that's going to be their main go-to, there's a couple reasons that you want to have a bunch of weapons stockpiled for throwing weapon characters. The first is that if you initiate combat with your thrown weapon, it won't return to you because of a bug in the game. So you want to usually initiate combat with just a random dagger or Handaxe or Javelin that you're just carrying around. And the second is that any character can throw a thrown weapon for additional damage dice. You don't have to be spec'd into throwing. So it gives a lot of melee characters ranged weapon attacks, and Handaxes are a really good setup for that. Most throwing weapon characters are going to carry a big stockpile of Handaxes, Javelins, and Daggers for exactly that reason. So I'm going to give them B tier because they will be something that you need for this effect, but there's a lot of ways to duplicate it. You just need a few of this item stacked up. But it is very good if you have throwing weapon characters in your party, and also just useful to carry around for any party member. The Javelin is another thrown weapon that does a d6 of damage, so it's going to have exactly the same amount of usage as the Handaxe for thrown weapon characters, and just to carry around with your party. It also comes with the Piercing Strike weapon action, which inflicts Gaping Wounds. Gaping Wounds causes any attacks against the character to deal an extra 2 damage, and is one of the better weapon actions, I think. Though, since you're usually using your Javelins to throw, you won't often actually be activating Gaping Wounds, because that can only be done as a melee attack, not as part of a thrown attack with the Javelin. One funny thing about the Javelin is that the flavor text for it says, "A rusted fishing harpoon repurposed as a weapon," and you can clearly see from the picture that this does not look at all like a fishing spear nor a harpoon. So clearly the flavor text department and the art department weren't talking to each other about that one. But other than that, the Javelin has exactly the same usage as the Handaxe to stockpile in your party so that you always have a weapon with decent base throwing damage equipped or available in order to hurl at enemies. B tier for the Javelin as well. The Light Hammer has all exactly the same weapon properties as clubs, with the concussive smash weapon action, a d4 of damage, and they're light weapons, but they're also thrown. So they're just strictly better than clubs. If you wanted to use a club, you could just use a Light Hammer, and then have the option to throw it as well. It has the same usage as the other thrown weapons, but the Light Hammer is a little worse, because it does only a d4 of damage, and so you have much less interest in throwing it than the higher damage weapons in B tier, and also it's worse than the dagger, because when you throw a dagger, it sort of flies in a straight line, whereas when you throw any of these other weapons, they fly in an arc, making them much more likely to be interrupted by roofs and terrain and stuff like that. So overall, the Light Hammer's role is just filled better by Handaxes, Javelins, and Daggers, and so I just don't see any particular reason to pick this up. You can find plenty of the other kinds of weapons. D tier for the Light Hammer. The Mace does a d6 of damage and has concussive smash, just like the club and Light Hammer, so when wielded in one hand, it's just better than those two weapons. It's not light, so you can't dual wield it, but if used alongside a shield, it's the best simple weapon in the very early game for a melee character. Usually that means that a character like a cleric, who wants a one-handed weapon and shield, and only has simple weapon proficiency, is going to use a mace in the early game. obviously you're not going to keep this mace as soon as you get a better option, and you are going to never pick up a non-magical mace and equip it on your character later in the game. So I'm going to give it C tier, because it is, for the most part, better than these other non-magical weapons in the early game, but you might prefer a spear or quarterstaff as well. And obviously you're never going to try to equip a mace on your characters later in the game, so C tier seems pretty fair for that. Finally, the Sickle is a light weapon with Lacerate and a d4 of damage, so it has a worse weapon action than the club or light hammer, and is effectively the same otherwise. It does do slashing damage rather than bludgeoning damage, but in the early game that doesn't matter. So for the most part, it's just worse than the club, worse than the light hammer, which are already D tier, so you can guess that, unsurprisingly, Sickles are also D tier. The +1 versions of these weapons are available from merchants right from the beginning of the game, and have +1 to attack and damage over the base versions of these weapons. It's worth noting, though, that when you throw a weapon, it doesn't gain its enhancement bonus to attacks, even if it's a thrown weapon, but it does add the +1 to the damage. So it's less of an upgrade to the stockpile of throwing weapons than you might think, though of course still very useful. Unlike a lot of other weapon categories, you actually might end up using the +1 versions of these weapons for a while, because in Act 1, in early Act 1, there actually are not a lot of magical simple weapons to be had until you get later into the act. So if you've picked up some of these +1 weapons, they might actually be your character's weapon for a little bit. The +1 club is still pretty much useless, maybe if you haven't found any other magical weapons and your character has simple weapons, then you could use a +1 club, but for the most part you can safely ignore this, and honestly, if you're using a Handaxe or whatever already, I'd just save my money. The +1 to hit is just not going to be that impactful compared to like an extra potion or something. The +1 Javelin and Handaxe, on the other hand, are very good because they do additional damage, and for a thrown weapon character, you want as many magical thrown weapons as you can, because in the early game, especially before you get a returning weapon, these are going to be your main source of damage, and they're just useful to have on other weapons, so those are going into A tier, or on other characters, so those are going into A tier. The +1 Light Hammer, because it doesn't add its enhancement bonus to its attack rolls, only to its damage, is basically the equivalent for throwing a weapon to the Handaxes and Javelins. It's a slightly better melee weapon, of course, but it does the same average damage output, so it's also just going to go into D tier alongside the +1 club. And then the +1 Mace is a real upgrade over the default Mace. Whether it's worth investing in sort of depends on whether your cleric or whatever is actually making weapon attacks, which they often won't. So if you see this at a merchant, you may not buy it, and there isn't a guaranteed one for a while, except for purchasing from a merchant, so it can be a reasonable upgrade if you're actually making attacks, but if you aren't, then you can pretty safely skip this. I'm going to put it in B tier because it is an upgrade, but again, it's not one that I would really heavily go out of my way to pick up. And the first of the unique magical weapons, the Adamantine Mace. The Adamantine Mace is one of the adamantine items, and there are 6 of these in the game, and you can only make 2 of them in any given playthrough, so it's always going to be competing with those other items. It's a +1 mace with 2 special abilities. The first is that when you hit an object, so anything that's not an enemy, it's or alive, it's always critical, so you can use it to like break doors and stuff more easily. Not super important, but nice, I guess, for those circumstances. And the second is that it ignores resistance to bludgeoning damage. Now, this tooltip is actually a little misleading, because the tooltip says this weapon ignores resistance to bludgeoning damage, but it actually means if you have this item equipped, all bludgeoning damage you deal ignores resistances. So whether that's from a spell, from a thrown object, or from an unarmed attack. There is, in fact, a character that likes to ignore bludgeoning resistance and makes a lot of unarmed attacks, and that's a monk. So you can use this item as a stat stick for a monk in order to have your unarmed attacks ignore bludgeoning resistance. You could wield it in your main hand, and then your Flurry of Blows attacks will ignore resistances, or in your offhand, and then all of your unarmed strikes will ignore resistances. As a weapon, the Adamantine Mace is useless. It's significantly worse than the Adamantine armors for most parties, and even as a weapon, there are just better items, better maces that you can have around the same time, so you just will never want to use it as an actual weapon. But as a passive stat stick for a monk to let them ignore bludgeoning resistance, it can be pretty useful. It's a bit of a niche item, but for some encounters, maybe you can make use of it. It does come at a significant opportunity cost, so most parties still won't want it, but it does technically have a use, so C tier for the Adamantine Mace. The Ceremonial Mace is a normal +1 mace that's used in a story event. By the time you get access to this item, you have better options than a +1 mace, and if you wanted a +1 mace, you've been able to buy one for a really long time. So mechanically, in terms of its use as a weapon, it's D tier, even though it's used in story events. Next up, the Club of Hill Giant Strength. The Club of Hill Giant Strength is a normal light club with no enhancement bonus, so no bonus to hit or damage, but when wielded, it sets your strength to 19. Obviously, this is a super powerful effect. You get a ton of extra attribute points, you get a bunch of strength for free, it takes your weapon slot, so there are characters that don't care a lot about their weapon slot that can benefit from this effect. However, of course, in Baldur's Gate, the question with the items that set your strength is, why are you spending an item slot on this when the elixirs exist? The elixir of Hill Giant Strength both takes up a usually less valuable slot than your weapon, and also gives you 21 strength instead of 19, and then the Cloud Giant Strength elixir would give you 27. So for most characters who would want the Club of Hill Giant Strength, you're going to be better off with an elixir, because you get more strength, and then you can use a more powerful weapon to go with that strength that you now have in order to make attacks with a much harder hitting weapon than a normal light club. There is, however, one type of character, or two types of characters, that work extremely well with the Club of Hill Giant Strength. The first of these is Tavern Brawler characters. Just like with the Adamantine Mace, a Tavern Brawler monk can use the Club of Hill Giant Strength in its offhand, make all of its attacks with its main hand, and benefit from the full bonus +4 to strength from the Club of Hill Giant Strength. And you can do this in order to use a different elixir than a strength elixir for your monk. It also is pretty useful if you are like a dexterity monk in the early game. It can give you a bonus to your attacks, even if you intend to be a dexterity monk later on in the game. The second type of character is an archer using the Titan String Bow. The Titan String Bow adds your strength modifier to all of your attacks with it, to all of your damage with it. And so having 19 strength with the Titan String Bow means that you're adding +4 damage to all of your attacks. Again, for both of these types of characters, you have to ask the question, when is it better to use the Hill Giant Strength Club than a Strength Elixir? And the answer is, for most characters, it's better to just use the Strength Elixir. But if you have another elixir that you really want to use, say you're a Tavern Brawler build that is struggling with initiative and wants to use a Vigilance elixir, or you're built for critical hits and want to use a Viciousness elixir, or you want to use a Bloodlust elixir in order to just maximize your number of attacks, especially at lower difficulty settings where Bloodlust elixirs do even more in terms of additional attacks than they do on Honor mode, then the Club of Hill Giant Strength can free up your elixir slot by giving you effectively the strength elixirs at the cost of a weapon slot. So for an archer or a monk, this is actually a pretty good item. I'm going to give it A tier because it's not really an interesting alternative to other weapons. It's more an interesting alternative to the normal elixir slot for that kind of character. It also is pretty useful if you just want like your main character to be able to increase their encumbrance, which isn't a total 0 either. And like the jump distance and stuff is pretty nice as well. And of course for non-elixir runs and stuff, it's going to be incredibly powerful because boosting your strength is ridiculously strong. So most characters that would want this will prefer an elixir, but enough get really good value out of the club that I'm going to give it A tier. The Dragon's Grasp. The Dragon's Grasp is a magical handaxe with no enhancement bonus that when you hit a burning enemy, deals an extra d4 of slashing damage. Extra damage dice, even situational extra damage dice, are always pretty interesting on a weapon because those extra damage dice do more damage, and that's what weapons are for. And then also will be multiplied when you get a critical hit, and multiplied when you get more attacks in a round, and stuff like that. So even though this is a situational bonus to damage, it's still always worth looking at. The basic question with the Dragon's Grasp is are enemies burning frequently enough that you can trigger the additional damage dice often enough to make it better than a normal +1 handaxe? For most parties, the answer is going to be no. While it is relatively easy to set enemies on fire, in order to get enough value out of this extra damage die that it's worth giving up +1 to hit and just a normal +1 to damage compared to the +1 Handaxe, you'd have to be burning a lot of enemies. So for a more fire-themed party where you are using grease or alchemist fire or burning a lot of enemies, the Dragon's Grasp can be pretty good if you sort of build your strategy around setting enemies on fire a lot. But for most parties, it's not going to be better than just a normal +1 weapon. For that reason, I'm going to give it B tier because you can kind of build around it, and it's not bad if you do that, although you shouldn't structure your whole party around this kind of medium quality weapon, but if you are already doing, have a lot of burning in your party, it can be good. But for most parties, you'd rather just use 1 or 2 +1 Handaxes. Next up, the Loviatar's Scourge. The Loviatar's Scourge is a weapon you have to barter for or pickpocket from a specific NPC in the Goblin camp, so a lot of players probably haven't seen this weapon in their sort of normal playthroughs. It's a mace with no enhancement bonus, so a little less accurate than a normal +1 mace, but on every attack, it deals an extra d6 of necrotic damage to everything in melee range, including the wielder. So your target, yourself, your allies, any other enemies in melee range does a pretty big burst of necrotic damage. Depending how many enemies you're surrounded by, that can be a pretty big amount of damage. And although you take damage every time you swing, it also gives you resistance to necrotic damage, which means that you're taking a d6, but it's halved. Actually, it's a little more than halved because your round resistance is down. So you're going to be taking, on a 1, 2, or 3, you take 1 damage. On a 4 or 5 on the die, you take 2 damage. On a 6, you take 3 damage, meaning it's like 1 2/3 of a damage on average. So a little less than half of the average on a d6. And so for most characters, that's basically a rounding error. Taking 2-ish damage per attack is just not that big a deal for most characters, and some characters even actively want to be taking damage, so you can build around that as well. And as a weapon that deals 2d6 of damage, a one-handed simple weapon that deals 2d6 of damage, this is the highest damage simple weapon available at this point in the game, and actually for a pretty reasonable length of time. You can get this item quite early, you can set yourself in the middle of groups of enemies in order to trigger the AoE for even more damage, and you can mitigate the effects of this damage pretty well. The downside is relatively ignorable. Most characters don't care about taking a very small amount of necrotic damage every turn. I mean, 50% of the time it's 1 damage per attack, which is just not that big a deal. And the amount of damage that it increases your attacks by is pretty significant. For that reason, because this item just does a lot of damage, and any character that is using a one-handed simple weapon in order to do a lot of damage is going to want to use it, I'm going to give it S tier. It's available very early in the game, does a lot of damage, has some cool effects, because you can also use it on characters that actively want to hurt themselves. So this weapon is actually very powerful, and sort of an early game power spike for a lot of characters wielding one-handed simple weapons. Next up, the Redcap Sickle. The Redcap Sickle is a non-magical sickle, no enchantment at all, but unlike a normal sickle, which does a d4 of damage, the Redcap Sickle does 2d4 of damage. These drop from the Redcaps, so they're relatively early in the game, and this might be the highest damage weapon that you have for some simple weapon users at this point in the game. 2d4 is really not bad, and it's a dippable weapon, so you can add another d4 with fire damage by dipping it in fire. And so the main user for this would probably be like a Spore Druid or something, dual wielding them. But for those characters, you will typically prefer the accuracy bonus, because they're also adding their Spore Druid damage to every attack, so you'd rather use like +1 scimitars or something like that in order to land your Spore Druid attacks more often. Most characters, I think, are going to prefer the accuracy over the very small damage increase that the Redcap Sickle has over like a +1 Handaxe or a +1 Javelin or a +1 Short Sword or Scimitar if you're a character that can use those. So while the Redcap Sickle is kind of interesting in that it does a little bit more damage than most other base weapons, the loss of the enhancement bonus and the loss of the accuracy is pretty bad overall. For that reason, because it's not actually that much more damage than some of the other items that give you enhancement bonuses, I'm going to give it C tier. There is certainly some uses for it if your character is already very accurate with their attacks, but I think most characters will, on average, do more damage with a slightly lower base damage weapon that hits more frequently. The Ritual Axe. The Ritual Axe is a magical hand axe with no enhancement bonus, so just hits for a d6 of damage. But whenever you hit an enemy with it, they receive the spell Bane, the effect of the spell Bane, taking a 1d4 penalty to attack rolls and a 1d4 penalty to saving throws. This penalty is supposed to have a save against it, but it doesn't. So whenever you hit an enemy, they just receive this effect with no saving throw. And no saving throw debuffs are really, really powerful, of course. Minus 1d4 to enemy attack rolls is pretty good in longer fights, because the enemy will just miss their attacks more often. Minus 1d4 to saving throws can help you end fights immediately by locking down an enemy with a command spell or something that they roll worse on because of the saving throw penalty. In addition, this counts as a condition, so all of the items and stuff that care about inflicting conditions trigger off of the Ritual Axe. The downside of this axe is that when you hit an enemy with it, if you have 50% or more HP, the tooltip says 25% or more, but the tooltip is wrong, it's 50% or more, you take a d6 of slashing damage. That means that whenever you attack with this weapon, you do take some damage. It's similar to the Loviatar's Scourge, but a d6 of damage is a little bit more real than a d6 halved of damage. Of course, you can mitigate this by gaining resistance to slashing damage through Blade Ward, through being a Raging Barbarian, through having a Camp Caster cast Warding Bond on you if you're playing with Camp Casters. So the Ritual Axe does have some ways to mitigate the downsides. And of course, also some characters want to be at half hit points to trigger the items that care about that, or don't particularly care about being at low hit points. So the ability to inflict Bane with no saving throw is often worth taking the extra damage. As a damaging weapon, obviously, this one is not that great. It hurts you and doesn't do more damage than, in fact, does less damage than just the other basic items that you would have. But as a weapon that inflicts a debuff without a saving throw, it is much, much more interesting. That's a very powerful effect. You do have to build your party around it a little bit, but the ability to just inflict debuffs without saves on enemies is always really cool. So I'm going to give it A tier because you can really work with the Ritual Axe in the early game to win boss fights by debuffing them. Stacks really well with Radiating Orb as well for even more attack penalties and stuff. And overall, this is just such a powerful effect that it's very much worth looking at. Not every party's going to want it, but it is very good if you can optimize for it. The Salami. The Salami is identical to a normal club. It's a light weapon that hits for a d4 of damage and has the concussive smash ability. And so you might think that I will just say, you know, the Salami is a joke. Obviously, it's very funny to beat people to death with the Salami, but not mechanically interesting. However, there actually is one really cool thing mechanically about the Salami, and that is that it is both a weapon, meaning that you can bind it as like an Eldritch Knight or whatever, and a camp supply, so you can blind enemies when you throw it if you are a barbarian with the chimpanzee animal aspect. The chimpanzee animal aspect blinds enemies whenever you throw a camp supply at them, and the Salami allows you to have a returning Salami if you bind it as an Eldritch Knight. I did an entire build around this concept because you can pass out repeated blinds and debuff enemies massively, and so this character actually is pretty good with the synergy between Chimpanzee Barbarian, Eldritch Knight, and the Salami. That build is called the Salami Slinger. I was a little disappointed it actually got many fewer views than I thought it should, because it's an extremely funny concept and actually not a bad build, so go check it out. And that synergy alone makes the Salami actually a pretty powerful option for a very, very specific character. Now, for most characters, of course, the Salami isn't going to be very good, and obviously that's not like an optimal way to build the character, but it's much better than you might think. So I'm going to give the Salami C tier because it's used in one niche, kind of goofy build. And then obviously a bunch of like goofy YouTube videos where it's just worse but funnier than other weapons. But there is actually one mechanical use for the Salami where it is better than the other options. And you can go check out my video on that for more information about that if you too want to beat enemies with your meat. The Shattered Flail. The Shattered Flail is a +2 mace, so despite being called a flail, it's actually a mace, which honestly makes sense because maces were real and flails weren't. They're not really a historical weapon, though I'll save that rant for the flails section of the martial weapons tier list. The Shattered Flail is a +2 mace. available very early in the game, which obviously is powerful in and of itself, because +2 weapons this early are really awesome. And whenever you attack with it, you heal for whenever you deal damage with it, you heal for a d6 of health. That is quite powerful as well, because consistent healing like that, when it's free, is pretty good, and you get this healing based off of doing something that you would want to do already, attack, and so you get a lot of extra health with this character. That healing won't trigger a lot of the effects that trigger off of healing, but some of them it will, and so there's some synergies with this item as well. The downside of this item, because obviously an item with such amazing upsides does need a downside, is that when you hit an enemy with it, you gain 6 turns of a debuff, where if you ever go a turn without hitting an enemy, you go mad. You have to make a DC 12 Wisdom save if you don't hit an enemy, so either if you miss all your attacks in a round, can't reach an enemy in a round, or combat has ended. You're going to have to make a DC 12 Wisdom save until that debuff goes away, otherwise you go mad. Madness causes you to become hostile to every nearby creature, so your character will attack your allies, they'll attack NPCs, they'll use explosives and special arrows and stuff that are in their inventory. So if you're going to use this weapon, you really have to avoid that downside, because it is a pretty powerful downside. There's a couple ways to do this. The first, of course, is to have long combats where you just hit enemies every turn and then you don't have to make the save at all. And the second is to increase your wisdom save to the point where you can easily pass a DC 12 save. DC 12 isn't that high in the early game. You might fail some of these, but as you get up a couple levels, you'll be able to get items that give you advantage on wisdom saves, items that increase your saving throws. You can use the resistance cantrip for an extra D4. You can use Bless for an extra D4. So you have a lot of options for increasing your saving throws so that you can pass the DC 12 wisdom save very reliably. Once you can do that, this weapon is just awesome. +2 mace that heals you on every single attack is incredible, even before you get to the cool synergies, like with other healing items, with the periaptive wound closure that turns the D6 into just a flat 6 healing per attack, and especially with things like Swords Bards and Tigerheart Barbarians that can attack multiple enemies with one weapon attack. A Tigerheart Barbarian can hit up to 3 enemies with this attack. That's 3d6 of healing, which of course is amazing when you get it for free, and you can do that multiple times per turn once you get extra attack. So this can turn your character into kind of a lifesteal tank, something that doesn't really otherwise exist in Dungeons & Dragons, in a way that makes it both a super powerful item, but also one that enables a bunch of cool, unique strategies. This item definitely comes with a downside, so you do have to put in a little bit more effort to get the maximum value out of it, which is kind of a theme with the simple weapons in general. But when you do that, it is definitely an incredibly powerful item, really good for the builds that it's good for, and also any character that can reliably pass the wisdom save can just throw this weapon on, because it's just a powerful weapon in and of itself. S tier for the Shattered Flail, although of course you do need to take care to mitigate the risks that come with using this item. The Shining Staver-of-Skulls. The Shining Staver-of-Skulls is a +1 light hammer that has a light radius, so it works like a torch and lights the area around you, and also does an extra d4 of radiant damage. Extra d4 of damage is great. You can use this as a bound weapon for an Eldritch Knight to deal extra damage on attacks. It's radiant damage, which means that it applies radiating orbs and stuff like that, and so there's a lot of uses for this item. It comes kind of late in Act 1, so depending on your routing, you could have a much more powerful item with radiant damage on it, which we'll talk about in a second. But the Shining Staver-of-Skulls is going to be one that most parties should just carry, because if you need a thrown weapon in a pinch, this is one of the best ones out there, especially in the early game, just because of the extra damage die on it. And of course, you can use it to trigger synergies for specific builds. I'm going to give it A tier because you're not going to use it full time on most characters, though some can, but pretty much every party should pick this up because sometimes you just need a weapon that you can throw. The Sickle of Boooal. The Sickle of Boooal is a Redcap Sickle, basically, so it's a sickle with 2d4 base damage, but it has advantage on attacks against bleeding enemies. Getting enemies bleeding is relatively easy, but often costs you an action, so you're using your turn, or at least some of your turn, in order to trigger advantage, which isn't generally something that I like to do. I'd rather just make more attacks rather than spend one of them throwing like a bleed grenade or something like that. For a character that inflicts bleeding naturally, the Sickle of Boooal could be maybe kind of interesting, because advantage on attacks is powerful, but this weapon, by the time that you get it, is fairly weak in and of itself. 2d4 damage is just not that exciting at this point in the game. So maybe you could do something with this with a bleeding build, but for the most part, I think this one's safe to ignore. Obviously, this is mostly used in a story event to get the buff permanently, in which case it's more interesting, but the effect of the weapon itself is much less powerful overall, because it takes up a weapon slot, so you can't use a good weapon alongside the advantage for bleeding. I'm going to give it C tier because advantage is always an effect that's worth looking at, but this is a weak enough weapon and with a specific enough requirement to trigger that advantage that I think most of the time you're going to be better off with other stuff. The Skybreaker. Okay, so first off, you can't tell me that this picture is intended to be a light hammer. Obviously, this should be a heavy hammer, but it is a light hammer. It's a +1 light hammer that once per long rest lets you cast Searing Smite like the Paladin spell for an extra d6 of fire damage and lighting enemies on fire for more damage over time. The additional damage that you get from this spell means that you get basically one good attack with it a day. As a +1 light hammer, you're giving up a lot of damage compared to other weapons in order to get that effect. And so, unless you know that there's going to be a combat that's only going to last one turn, where you just have to burn down an enemy as quickly as possible, and then in that case, you're probably better off spending your first action on a scroll or grenade or something like that than trying to hit with the Searing Smite. You're just not going to ever want to use this weapon. I just think that this one is too situational and too not powerful to be that interesting, and so I'm going to give it D tier. I mean, maybe you could use it on a paladin for an extra smite per day, but the Searing Smite isn't even that good a smite, and a lot of enemies are resistant or whatever to fire damage, so honestly, you can just leave this one at home. The Sussur Sickle. The Sussur Sickle is one of the 3 Sussur flower weapons, or Sussur wood weapons, that you can get. So you have to choose between the sickle, the dagger, and the greatsword. When you hit it's a +1 sickle, and when you hit an enemy with it, they have to make a DC 12 con save or become silenced. That's a pretty powerful effect. Silencing an enemy is pretty good. DC 12 con save, obviously, fairly easy to pass for a lot of enemies, but if you make them make enough saves, then you can silence them. And in honor mode, that's especially good because a lot of the most dangerous legendary actions and stuff require the enemy to be able to speak. That being said, you have to compare this to the greatsword, and if you have a greatsword user, the greatsword is better, and the dagger is just strictly better than the sickle because the dagger has the same damage die, the same attack bonus, a better weapon action, and also is finesse, so can be used with either dexterity or strength. So unless you really like the aesthetic of the Sussur Sickle, there's never any reason to make it over the other 2 Sussur weapons, so I'm going to give it D tier. This is not because it's a bad weapon in and of itself, but because it is directly competing with options that are just strictly better than it. The Blood of Lathander. The Blood of Lathander, available near the end of Act 1, is the first legendary simple weapon that you have access to. It's a legendary +3 mace, with a whole bunch of magical effects. So firstly, this is a +3 mace, which obviously makes it awesome in and of itself. +3 weapons are just really good because they hit more reliably and do more damage. Next, once per long rest, if you go to 0 hit points, you heal for 2d6, coming back to life immediately, and heal all allies for a d6 within 30 feet of you. That effect is not one I would rely on, but if you do get into a truly terrible situation and your character goes down, it does save them, which is pretty nice. So Lathander's Blessing, not something I'd rely on, and not something that I would pick the weapon for in and of itself, but a nice little bonus on top of the other abilities. The next ability sheds light in a 20-foot radius, and undead and fiends within that light have to make a con save or become blinded. Just passively blinding a whole bunch of the most dangerous enemies in the game is, of course, incredible. It's a condition, so it applies radiating orbs and reverberation that are applied by conditions. It will blind enemies, making them even more likely to miss their attacks. So if you're a cleric who's doing radiating orb stuff, it synergizes with this. And when you get this item, you're about to fight a lot of undead, so blinding all the undead that you're about to fight is of course amazing. And shedding light is also pretty nice when you go into the Shadow Cursed lands. And then finally, it lets you cast Sunbeam, just the level 6 spell Sunbeam, once per long rest. I mean, this is a level 6 spell that you get in Act 1, and it's a pretty good one for a whole bunch of damage. So any of these effects, just being a +3 mace would be enough to put it in S tier, but it also passively blinds undead and fiends, making it incredibly useful. It does additional, and it also lets you cast Sunbeam, doing a whole bunch of radiant damage to enemies, applying radiant effects, and also just frying enemies. Kind of wins one encounter per day at the point where you get it, because a 6th level spell should be just good enough to win the encounter. Obviously, the Blood of Lathander is a legendary weapon, so it should be S tier, and it definitely is. Next up, the Torch. The Torch, the humble, non-magical torch that every character starts with, is actually a surprisingly good weapon. When lit, it deals a d4 of damage, because it just works like a club, but then also a d4 of fire damage. Which means that at base, the torch is actually the best one-handed damage-dealing weapon in the game, starting from the very beginning of the game. 2d4 of damage is better than like a longsword's 1d8 or anything like that, and so this weapon actually outpaces even martial weapons in terms of damage. Sort of. You can duplicate the effect of the torch on any weapon by dipping it in fire. So if you have a candle or in fact a torch, you place it on the ground and you spend a bonus action to dip it in fire, that weapon will deal an extra d4 of fire damage. So the torch's advantage does get eaten if you're willing to spend time before combat dipping all your weapons in order to maximize your damage output. So for characters that are really looking to min-max, you won't need to use torches because all of your weapons effectively will be torches. In addition to that effect, though, of just being a really good weapon, the torch has a couple other things going for it. Firstly, it's a club, so you can use Shillelagh on it for a d8 plus a d4 of fire damage, making it a really good weapon for clerics or druids, nature clerics or druids, in the early game. Though again, you can use a quarterstaff or something along those lines dipped in fire, it'll be the same amount of damage. And you can also light areas with it and set things on fire. This sounds not that exciting, but being able to light an area is always good, and being able to set things on fire, including by throwing a lit torch into something that's flammable, like a puddle of grease, is incredibly useful throughout the game. There's lots of ways to do this with the firebolt cantrip, with a flaming arrow, with an alchemist fire grenade, but a lit torch is one of them, and being able to set fires is always helpful. So Torch has a lot of really nice effects, light, decent damage output, lighting fires, almost all of which are done slightly better by other weapons, other things that are more specialized. Light is done better by the light cantrip, lighting fires is usually done better with fire arrows, dealing damage is usually done better by dipping a weapon in fire, but the torch does all of these things in one, so it's pretty useful. And if, like me, you are much too lazy to dip all of your weapons in fire before you go into a combat, then the torch is the best damage output weapon for when you are stuck using non-magical weapons. Given that it has all of these abilities which can be duplicated by players that are looking to optimize in better ways, I'm going to give it B tier because these are all good abilities, but there are better options for each of them, but it has enough abilities that it's still just worth carrying a pile of torches in order to use them. And finally, for the Act 1 items, the Xyanyde. Xyanyde is a +1 mace that when you miss an attack, once per short rest, you can inflict fairy fire on the enemy for 2 turns, giving yourself and all allies advantage on attacks against that enemy. This is kind of cool because there's no saving throw against this effect. So if you miss an attack against an enemy, you and your entire party get advantage on attacks against that enemy, probably for the rest of combat, because 2 turns of advantaged attacks should be enough to bring down almost any enemy in the game. The fact that this is also just a default +1 mace, which is a weapon that you're not embarrassed to use, and has a pretty powerful effect on a missed attack, which most weapons do not, make it a fairly interesting weapon. I think in general you're going to prefer the extra damage from Loviatar's Scourge or the healing from the Shattered Flail at this point, but you can get the Xyanyde pretty early depending on your story choices. And obviously later in the act you're going to replace it with the Blood of Lathander. But the Xyanyde is in and of itself pretty good. I think it goes in A tier because you'll want to sub it in for like boss fights against single strong enemies so that you have a potential out if you are missing a lot of your attacks against them, and it's much less effective against lots of other enemies. But overall, this weapon effect is pretty good, and again, no saving throw works on a miss, so it's one of the most reliable effects in the entire game, which is kind of neat in and of itself. So, at the end of Act 1, most characters that want a simple weapon are going to be using the Blood of Lathander. This is just the most powerful simple weapon in Act 1 by a pretty wide margin. Getting Sunbeam and stuff is really, really good, and of course the passive effect is huge, so you do want this equipped in your party for Act 2. But characters that are built around optimizing it will still often be using the Shattered Flail, and Throne characters, most parties should have stockpiled the +1 weapons with the Throne attribute so they can hurl them at people, and throwing weapon characters will especially be interested in +1 javelins, +1 handaxes, and the shining Staver-of-Skulls. The Club of Hill Giant Strength will go on monks or archers who need the strength bonus but are interested in using another elixir, but the real winner, of course, in Act 1 is going to be the Blood of Lathander. Let's go to Act 2. First up in Act 2, the Ironwood Club. The Ironwood Club is a +1 club that when you cast Shillelagh on it, adds an extra d4 of bludgeoning damage. So this weapon with Shillelagh will deal a d8 of base damage because of the Shillelagh effect, and then a d4 of bludgeoning damage, and then if you light it on fire, an extra d4 of fire damage. So it's actually a pretty powerful weapon when it has Shillelagh cast on it. It's possible that a Shillelagh user, like a nature cleric or druid, will prefer to use a magical quarterstaff. In fact, it's pretty likely at this point. But this is a pretty high damage option because the extra damage dice that you get from this alongside Shillelagh give you a pretty powerful damaging effect. And for a Spore Druid who wants probably to have 2 weapons, this can be one of the weapons, using this with Shillelagh and then maybe something else with your offhand. With let's say you have high dexterity and high wisdom, so you can use this with the Shillelagh effect, attack with your wisdom, and then have a light weapon, a finesse weapon like a dagger in your offhand to attack with your dexterity, and apply your Spore Druid damage with both weapons. This can be a pretty powerful option. And also just for a character that's using Shillelagh alongside a shield, the Ironwood Club does a decent amount of damage. It also adds the Backbreaker weapon action in addition to Club's default concussive smash, so you can knock an enemy prone, which is probably the best weapon action overall, because prone is so powerful in Baldur's Gate 3. I guess the best one other than Brace, because Brace doesn't take an action. And so the Ironwood Club is going to be pretty useful if you're casting a lot of Shillelagh. How often are you doing that? Probably not that often, and a lot of characters that are still going to prefer a staff or something along those lines. So I'm going to give it B tier, but this weapon is really not bad for doing the thing that it's supposed to do. I think this weapon would be really cool and interesting if it showed up in Act 1, but because it is in Act 2, it's competing with sort of more powerful stuff at this point, but still not a terrible weapon overall. The Moonlantern. The Moonlantern is a story item. It's a club with no enhancement bonus or magical effects when you attack. It's used for a story event, of course, so obviously it's useful for that story event. But in terms of its actual utility as a weapon, not that interesting. The only neat thing about it is that it's a versatile club. So it's a club, which normally aren't versatile, but you can wield it two-handed for a d6 of damage. I don't recommend doing that for any reason, but obviously the Moonlantern is useful for the story event. I'm going to rate its utility as a weapon rather than its utility as a story item and put it in D tier, because obviously it doesn't do much damage, but you will use this item for its story effect. The Shadow Lantern. The Shadow Lantern is a club, just like the Moonlantern, a versatile club, and it's a story item obtainable only with Gale in your active party. It, just like the Moonlantern, isn't good to attack with, but it also lets you conjure a shadow once per long rest. A Shadow is a pretty good summon overall. It has relatively low HP and AC, but very good damage output for a summon at this point in the game, with a 2d8 plus 2d4 attack just by default, and it can also drain strength for 3d8 necrotic damage, so it does a decent amount of damage output, and if you can keep it alive, it's going to be a lot of damage. The downside of this item is that the Shadow goes away if you unequip the item, so you do have to have it equipped in your weapon slot in order to use the Shadow. But if you do that, then you get a pretty powerful summon once per day, and if the Shadow dies, you can obviously just swap to a different weapon. There are a lot of characters that don't really care that much about their weapon slot, especially when they can use this one-handed along with a shield. And so if you compare this to like a magical staff or something that a wizard might be using, there's a decent chance that you would prefer to have a Shadow for a bunch of extra damage over, say, +1 save DC or something that you might have from a staff at this point. If you have a Spore Druid or a character like that just wants to hit with their attacks and all their damage comes from their Spore Druid passive rather than the actual damage of their weapons, then they can use this item as well. And so the Shadow Lantern has a lot of usage. Obviously, once the Shadow dies, it's not that good, and you're going to swap to other weapons and after that. And many characters do need their weapon slot, and so won't want to use the Shadow Lantern, but for the characters that don't care that much about it, it's pretty good. I'm going to give it A tier because it does have real downsides, costing you a whole weapon slot in order to get this summon. But summons are really, really good, and so a lot of parties can make use of the Shadow Lantern in a pretty powerful way for at least some encounters in a given adventuring day. And finally, for Act 2 weapons, that's right, there are only 4 Act 2 simple weapons, and 2 of them are story items. Wulbren's Hammer. Wulbren's Hammer is a +1 light hammer. Again, uses art that does not look like a light hammer. So it's a pretty bad weapon in and of itself, especially for Act 2, but it also does an extra 2d4 force damage against objects. This property isn't listed in the weapon description anywhere, but if you hit an object with it, like a door or something, then you'll do an extra 2d4 force damage. Breaking doors is just not that exciting in effect for a weapon to have, so Wulbren's Hammer is just not something that I would recommend equipping. D tier, because it's low damage and bad. And moving on to the Act 3 weapons, the +2 Mace. I'm putting it in Act 3 because the only guaranteed location I know for it is in Act 3, but also this is available from random merchant inventory, so it's possible you can buy it in Act 2. Either way, don't bother, you have a +3 Mace already, so you just don't need a +2 Mace. D tier. The Comeback Handaxe. The Comeback Handaxe is one of the joke items that you get in Act 3. It is a thrown handaxe with the returning property, so it's one of the few weapons that returns to you when thrown, but it returns to you by hitting you. So when you throw the Comeback Handaxe, it's a +1 handaxe, so it'll hit for a d6 +1 damage, and then it'll come back and hit you for a d6 +1 damage. It's also unique in that, unlike every other returning weapon, it doesn't equip itself when it returns, it goes to your inventory. So this does have some kind of interesting uses, because it's a thrown weapon that you can have, it's a thrown returning weapon that you can use stat sticks with. You can use other weapons that just give you passive benefits and equip both of them, and the Comeback Handaxe will allow you to throw it, benefit from the passive benefits of stuff like the Club of Hill Giant Strength in your main and offhand, and then because it goes back to your inventory, it won't actually disrupt them. So even though this is a joke item, it does have some very minor usage. Taking a d6 +1 of damage on the return isn't a big deal, because you're going to be doing most of your damage with like Tavern Brawler and stuff, and it won't add Tavern Brawler damage on the return. It's just the base damage of the weapon, not your strength. So the Comeback Handaxe actually does have some kind of funny and interesting uses. I'm going to give it C tier, because most throwing characters will not want to do this, but if you have a very specific setup in mind with 2 weapons that give you passive benefits and a throwing weapon, then the Comeback Handaxe is the only way in the game to do that. The Deva Mace. The Deva Mace is the highest damage weapon in the entire game by a pretty wide margin. because it's not a weapon that you're supposed to be able to get. This weapon's obtainable through glitches. There's various different methods to get it, which they've patched out some of, but not all of. So even in the current patch, you can still get the Deva Mace. You have to plug in a controller on PC, so this is very much not an intended item for you to have. But if you do follow those glitches, you get a weapon with a d6 of base damage plus 4d8 radiant damage on every single attack. That's a massive amount of damage. Of course, it's doubled with critical strikes. It's a one-handed weapon, so with the dual wielder feat, you can dual wield them and get even more damage. And so the highest damage setups in the entire game are going to be using the Deva Mace. Again, this is bug abuse, so whether you're interested in doing this, of course, is up to you. But if you do it, you're going to get the absolute highest damage output weapon in the game. I'm not going to spend too much time on this item because it's bugged. It does way more damage than any other item in the game, so obviously it's going to be S tier. I personally wouldn't recommend using it unless you know you're going to have fun just blendering enemies with the absurd damage output of this weapon. Also, you're going to miss a lot of attacks because it has no enhancement bonus, and that's kind of sad. But if you really just want to maximize your damage output, this is the item for you. The Devotee's Mace. I'm putting this one in Act 3 because you have to be level 10 to get it. Obviously, if you've gotten a lot of XP, you can hit level 10 in Act 2, and so some playthroughs are going to get the Devotee's Mace in Act 2, some of them will get it in Act 3, but for the most part, I think it's an Act 3 weapon. It's the other legendary mace alongside the Blood of Lathander. All of the legendary simple weapons are maces, which is kind of interesting. And it's a +3 mace that does an extra d8 of radiant damage on every attack. That means it's a pretty high damage weapon. An extra d8 of damage on top of being a +3 weapon is really good already. And it's radiant damage, which is one of the better damage types, because it lets you trigger radiating orbs and stuff like that. And of course, it's a cleric weapon, so the character that's interested in using the Devotee's Mace is probably going to be your radiating orb character in general anyways, so there's some inherent synergy there. In addition to just being a good weapon at base with its base stats, it also gives you Healing Incense Aura, so once per long rest, as a bonus action, for 10 turns, you can activate this, and you and your allies within 30 feet will heal for a d4 at the start of every turn. That can apply the buff on heal items, which is pretty powerful to do that in a big AoE. It can get up down to allies. It can keep your allies just healing overall. This will trigger the bonus healing from Life Cleric and stuff like that. So there's a lot of synergy with the Healing Incense aura, as well as just being very powerful in and of itself. Or reasonably powerful in and of itself. It's a lot of healing, so even though healing isn't the strongest strategy in Dungeons & Dragons, this ends up being a pretty decent amount of healing for relatively free, because you can trigger it before combat starts. And overall, the Devotee's Mace is just an awesome weapon for any character that wants to actually attack with their simple main hand weapon, or is still using the buff on healing item set, or is doing radiating orb stuff. Basically, you're going to be choosing between this and the Blood of Lathander for most characters, and often what I will do is use Sunbeam off the Blood of Lathander and then swap to the Devotee's Mace for the rest of the day. But there are definitely a couple different combinations that you can use with that. You can also just equip both if you have the dual wielder feat. You can get multiple Devotee's Maces also, because you can have your hirelings respec as clerics, and the number that you can get, the number of times you can get this Divine Intervention effect for the mace is based on the character, so you can get a bunch of Devotee's Maces. You usually won't need more than one, but it's an option. S tier, because it's a pretty powerful legendary weapon, and it does live up to the legendary status. The Handmaiden's Mace. The Handmaiden's Mace is a +2 mace that does an extra d6 of poison damage on every attack. It also sets the wielder's strength score to 18. So very similar to the Club of Hill Giant Strength, which sets your strength to 19, the Handmaiden's Mace sets it to 18. The likelihood that you need a second copy of a weapon that sets your strength to 19, I think, is pretty low, or to +4 is pretty low. But I suppose if you're doing a no elixir run with a bunch of strength users, you could get some benefit out of the Handmaiden's Mace, so it's got some utility for a no elixirs run. But it shows up quite late in the game when a +2 weapon that does an extra d6 of poison damage is not that exciting in and of itself. It does have maybe some usage as well for poison damage builds, because there are the poison synergy items, and this weapon does do poison damage with every single attack. So that could give you a little bit more synergy with the poison synergy items. That's a pretty niche build, and one that is quite weak in Act 3, because a lot of enemies are immune to poison at this point. But between those two niche effects, I think this item is sort of either C or B tier for like no elixir runs, setting your strength to 18, and for poison synergy. I think overall I'm going to give it C tier because both of those are kind of reaches. But in a particular party comp, the Handmaiden's Mace might see some play. In general, though, I just don't think that's very likely for most parties. The Infernal Mace. The Infernal Mace is a +2 mace that deals 3 poison damage on a hit. The Handmaiden's Mace, because it sets your strength to 18, might have some use, and the d6 of poison damage is better than a flat 3. The Infernal Mace is sort of duplicated by that effect, and obviously that was already a kind of weak item anyways, so D tier for this item, just not enough damage for Act 3. The Torch of Revocation. The Torch of Revocation is a +1 torch, so it's a club with a +1 enhancement bonus. That also deals a d4 of necrotic damage on every attack. So basically it deals a d4 of bludgeoning +1, a d4 of necrotic, and a d4 of fire when it's lit. Obviously you can duplicate this effect on a lot of other weapons just by dipping them in fire. And so the Torch of Revocation, the thing that it sort of uniquely does of doing 2 different elemental damage types, can be kind of duplicated by other effects. At this point in the game, 3d4 +1 of damage from your main hand weapon is just not that exciting. You have much better options for the vast majority of characters. And so the Torch of Revocation, unfortunately, despite being pretty cool, and for a character with Shillelagh or something, it seems like a good option, but you'd much rather, for the most part, just use those effects on a magical staff or one of the higher tier weapons from this set. Sadly, because I really like this weapon and want it to be good, I'm going to have to give it D tier. And finally, the Wavemother's Sickle. The Wavemother's Sickle is a +2 sickle, so a d4 +2 of damage, that also does a d4 of cold damage on every attack, and has advantage on attacks against wet enemies. Advantage against wet enemies is moderately useful. Most of the time, if you get an enemy wet, you're just planning to obliterate them with a lightning bolt or something like that, so the advantage on attacks won't be that great. But it does mean that you'll hit more often with the cold damage from this weapon, which will then get doubled, because wet enemies are vulnerable to cold. Any weapon that does cold damage on hit is always going to be at least moderately interesting, because the extra cold damage can be easily doubled by giving enemies vulnerability, and this weapon, just by virtue of doing 2d4 damage and being a +2 weapon, is actually a pretty good option for a dual-wielding Spore Druid who doesn't have short sword proficiency, so you've probably been using 2 scimitars or something like that up until this point. For that reason, I'm going to give it B tier, because it does a decent amount of damage, the advantage is relevant, there is a character that might want it, though often that character will still have better options. So B tier seems fair for the Wavemother's Sickle, just because the amount of damage it can do is at least moderately respectable once you've factored in a lot of the doubling and stuff. So, at the end of Act 3, characters that are using these simple weapons are most likely going to be using some combination of the Blood of Lathander to cast Sunbeam, and then swapping it in for the Devotee's Mace, or just using the Devotee's Mace full time in order to get the healing. The Deva Mace is going to show up, of course, on characters that are spec'd to do massive amounts of damage with it, with guaranteed criticals from Luck of the Far Realms and stuff. So if you are trying to just maximize your damage output, bug abuse, and all, then the Deva Mace is going to be the weapon that shows up most often. And there are definitely some other items in lower tiers that will show up occasionally. The Shadow Lantern will have some usage, because the Shadow Summon is still pretty relevant throughout the entire game, and the throwing weapons will be a useful stockpile for your party to make sure your melee characters always have a ranged weapon ranged option to attack with. The +1 hand axes and javelins that you can throw will definitely be useful for them. Overall, this weapon category, I would say, is intended to be weapons that you equip only if you don't have access to better weapons. And for the most part, that's true, but there are definitely some really, really powerful options in here. The Blood of Lathander, the Devotee's Mace, and the Deva Mace, of course, are really great. The Shattered Flail enables a whole set of builds all by itself. And in the early game, Loviatar's Scourge is really powerful as well. So this weapon category, despite being kind of the weapon category for characters that don't really use weapons, still has a lot of really interesting options, and definitely it's worth looking at. Alright, my friends, I hope that you have enjoyed this look at all of the simple weapons in Baldur's Gate 3. If you think that I missed something, or you want me to move something around, definitely do let me know. Of course, I'm always open to moving things around if you have a good enough argument as to why something should be in a different tier. As always, I say this in some of these videos, people have very strong feelings about tier lists, so be civil to one another in the comments. I don't care if you're rude to me, but, be civil to each other, because I'm trying to foster a friendly community space here. As always, of course, if you have enjoyed the video, please feel free to leave a comment and hit like. Helps me out a ton with the algorithm. And of course, you can subscribe to my channel for more tier lists and other Baldur's Gate 3 content and other strategy game content. I also want to apologize for lower amounts of Baldur's Gate content lately. It's just been a stressful and busy couple weeks, and these videos tend to take more effort than other games that I cover to produce, so I've just been doing a little bit less of Baldur's Gate, but we should be back on track pretty soon. Don't worry, Baldur's Gate's not going anywhere. I still have a lot of video ideas and things to cover, so definitely keep on tuning in for more of that. Alright, my friends, thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you next time.